Hello, U.S. history students. This is Mr. Baker again. This is Baker's Corner. And today we have the wonderful opportunity to explore one of my favorite aspects of any history, and that is the issue of reform. In other words, identifying things in our society that need to be changed and how leadership developed goals, strategies, and certainly outcomes and how to do it. So we have four major objectives. One is going to be identify the goals of the major reform movements in the early 19th century American history. Okay, so think about, all right, what are things in society that definitely have progress to be made? Okay, women's rights, abolition of slavery. Those of you that obviously, teach or are students, find that education back then would have been very different. In fact, the accessibility of it, especially in areas where I live in the current South, would have been very different compared to some other parts of the country, and even, some parts of the South that you had wealth. Like, for example, if you were a wealthy plantation owner's child, then it's a stronger degree of likelihood that you would have had a parent that would have put you in some kind of private school, and therefore your education level would have been very different compared to somebody who was, let's say, middle class, or maybe, even a farmer that basically had small amounts of land. So you notice, guys, disparity in that. We also notice other things along the lines of prison reform, things that are going to obviously impact us as far as religion. So a lot of cool things are on the docket for us to look at. Secondly, we want to describe the contributions of key reformers, people, organizations, events to improve society. Guys, you all have seen this in your lives up until now. Leadership matters a lot with the idea of how we are actually going to have society changing. Okay, so therefore we have people that take it upon themselves to make it their life's mission to actually make our society better. Okay. Thirdly, explain the outcomes and significance of major reform movements in American society. We're going to look at a couple of primary sources over the next few, hours with the time that you have to work on document analysis. And we're not going to do every single one of these reform movements, but we're going to break a few of them down. Right? What did abolitionists have to say about reform? What did people that really felt strongly about education, women's rights? And then fourthly, guys, explain how reform movements succeeded and or failed with expanding democratic values or principles in the early 19th century. Okay. So therefore, with that being said, let's hit the ground running. Okay. So I like to encourage you guys to stop your screen here and maybe do the warm-up that you see in front of you. This is meant to be about a 3 to 5 minute exercise. And then unpause your screen and we'll kind of work through this a little bit as best we can. Okay, what is reform? Now, we can get really complex with this, or we can make it fairly simplistic. Let's try to make it fairly simple. Reform is meant to improve society. Okay, now that could be a big goal for a large group, it could be a goal for a small group. At the end of the day, guys, you're identifying something of our society that's broken, that needs fixing. Okay. And so the first thing that we need to do is that we need to understand that change has needs. Otherwise, we wouldn't need reform, right? We would need social justice to be better. We wouldn't need, obviously, economic justice, whatever kind of justice involves reform. Okay. And so, first of all, we identify what needs to be changed. All right. Any of these leaders, doesn't matter whether it's modern, as in now. All right. You could look at a famous athlete that has a vision of reform, somebody like LeBron James or whoever it might be, that has a vision of how to use their craft of basketball or politics or whatever it might be to actually move our society toward a better society through reform. Right. So, think about this in a very big way, okay? Actions. Leadership matters. Guys, the idea of people speaking out, doing things, writing, giving speeches, okay? Attending conferences, the list goes on and on. In other words, some degree of active participation with the idea of reform, all right? They rise to make changes and efforts are made to inform others. Okay, So you have a vision, you got to get people on board, strengthen numbers, and then evaluation. How can we tell that change is or has taken place? Now, one thing I want to caution y'all with, guys, is remember, we're looking at approximately about 1825 until about 1850 as far as the scope of a lot of our history with reform. Don't necessarily be thinking, you know, as far ahead. I mean, certainly the outcomes of now are important, but guys, think about with evaluation, what within that time period is happening that's impacting change, etc. Okay. All right. So that'll kind of help you break these down. So first of all, guys, the basic nuts and bolts of political freedoms is, remember, America is a country that has a heritage of types of democracy. All right. I would not say, pardon me, that we're fully democratic. I would, however, say that we have elements of democracy within our system that actually allow us to move forward and have further goals. Remember that idea from the Declaration of Independence, all men created equal. There is tons of debate out there. Books have been written, articles published, whatever, about the idea of what in the world does that really mean? Did that include women? Did that include all ethnic groups? Did that include all other groups that have diversity to them? The answer is, guys, it's very, very open to interpretation. What it does, however, whether you want to give the founding fathers a praise for that or not, it gives us a springboard that makes us think, you know what? It's a heritage of building upon where America was at that point in time. Okay. So when we think of the democratic process, a couple of things, guys, that might be good to write down here are equality. Okay. Natural rights. Okay. We're all born with certain rights according to people like John Locke. Okay. And then citizen participation. Okay. Now, a lot of you guys are familiar, about 60% of Americans, about the most participatory thing that they're going to do as far as democracy is vote. While that is true, okay, citizen participation also involves advocating for causes, getting involved, etc. So what major groups desired these levels of equality that unfortunately were not there? Women, when you're looking, guys, at limits to them even owning property, voting rights gets a lot of attention. And then, of course, Native Americans with, we're seeing and have seen them moving further west. And, certainly there's a lot of history that happens there after the 1820s with the Trail of Tears and things. And then also African Americans. Now, guys, keep in mind, you do have a sizable meaning, sizable minority of African Americans that are free African Americans that live in a lot of northern states, some in southern states. But of course, the largest majority, guys, keep in mind, in southern states are going to be those that are linked to the bond of slavery. Okay, so therefore, what does that mean? It means that you're going to have a lot of opinions about how do you go about trying to overcome those histories of what some people would call usurpations, or definitely limits to their freedoms, equalities, etc. Okay, so where do we get started? Well, the basics of reform. Okay, so first of all, one really big picture idea here, guys, is that women and religion are going to greatly impact a lot of these other movements. This is causation. This is cause and effect. Okay, so women start to get more active with, church groups and things like that. They start to become more active with their own rights, advocating for abolition. Okay, and so therefore, what do we notice? A lot of women are going to become abolition reformers. They're going to become advocates of prisons. Dorothea Dix we'll look at more in a second. And then even education, amongst other things. Okay, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, think back to that concept of Republican motherhood. The idea of an educated citizenry is absolutely vital to a functioning democracy. If you believe that, which, I would say that that's definitely true, then that means that we want to have a functional society with knowledge and also the ability to use that knowledge to do something that makes society better. Ergo, a lot of women, guys, are going to get very involved in many of these different things, as men will as well. Okay, so as far as religion, we're going to be covering about 8 or 9 reform movements The Second Great Awakening is the first one. Again, these are not necessarily in any particular order of importance. But guys, if you really think about it, the Second Great Awakening happens about 100 years after the first one. The big picture with the Second Great Awakening, guys, is that we need morality and spiritual rebirth. Now, you all can land your plane on your agreements and disagreements with that, but to a large extent, this is going to be heavily emphasized with organized religion. Okay, you're going to see a commitment to newer denominations popping up, like for example, the furthering of denominations or groups like the Mormon or Church of Latter-day Saint, Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, excuse me. Okay, that's going to pop up under the leadership of Joseph Smith, and eventually, of course, Brigham Young, amongst others. And guys, what do we notice? We notice a lot of these denominations are gaining esteem and also, of course, numbers. Okay, the person that's probably given the most leadership potential with this is going to be a gentleman that you see on the screen here, guys, by the name of Charles Finney. He was kind of like a pastor, but also an evangelist. Okay, so you notice, guys, a lot of these things. So if you're trying to make people more moral, more spiritually reborn, you're trying to instill into them values and things that make them think about morality, then guys, think about it like that. Why is that going to play into things like prison reform? Why is that going to play into things like abolition? Okay, which not everybody had exactly the same views on, but nonetheless, the idea of slavery being immoral definitely, guys, is going to bring the attention. Now, a name that is not on here that might be worth noting, guys, is a gentleman by the name of Lyman Beecher, Beecher. And if you've ever heard of one of the most influential writers of the abolitionist movement by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe, it's no coincidence, guys, that her maiden name is Beecher. She's actually was, the actual daughter of Lyman Beecher. So there's a lot of influence in these movements that are actually infiltrating the other ones, again, cause and effect. Okay, now, where you notice, guys, some clash between the Second Great Awakening is when you get to the Transcendentalists. Okay, and a lot of you guys have heard of these if you've studied them in English. Thoreau and also Ralph Waldo Emerson. Henry David Thoreau was the other gentleman's whole name. But guys, if you think about it, this is a literary movement. Okay, so they wrote a lot of essays, a lot of things like that. They emphasize nature, self-reliance. There's a lot of connection, you could say, to some of those things that we looked at last time with Hudson River School, etc. Okay, as far as art and things. But guys, the idea of these guys in big picture form is, first of all, we need to act on our own beliefs. All right. Now, there is a school of thought out there, guys, that is a calling for people to be reform minded. Okay. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, somebody who wants to make society better, change it for the better, that kind of thing. And this is where there's a clash between transcendentalists and also the Second Great Awakening, and that is the nature of people. Okay, so a lot of the transcendentalist guys are going to be spiritual, but probably not as into the organized religion. They do not overall, from what I understand, agree with the concept of original sin, which you would have seen with the Second Great Awakening. They believe, as you can see here, that people are naturally good. Okay, so therefore, that's going to be the clash, one of them anyway, between the Second Great Awakening that believes that you need the spiritual rebirth in order to be saved or whatever. And as a result, that's going to be what leads you in the path of righteousness and morality. And therefore, you can start to reform society. So what's the difference? It's going to come back a lot of times to that nature of people, but both of them have a common calling, which is we as people should be absolutely committed to the idea of improving our society. Okay, so that's the common ground with transcendentalists and also the Second Great Awakening. Okay, all right, moving forward. So how do we see, guys, the idea of human nature, things like that affecting society? Well, we're not going to read over all these, but a couple of pastors and people that made these comments in the pulpit and other places. You'll notice that some of these, as you can see, are from the colonial days. and some of them are kind of moving us into the earlier 1800s. But guys, I mean, take a look at this. I exhort all. This is John Witherspoon, who was kind of seen as almost like I guess a mentor, you could say, to, I think, James Madison, if I'm not mistaken. I exhort all who are not called to go into the field to apply themselves with the utmost diligence to works of industry. Okay, so that is virtue. Guys, developing people of virtue. It is your power by this mean not only to supply the necessities, but to add to the strengths of your country. Industry, therefore, is a moral what? Duty. Of the greatest moment, absolutely necessary to national prosperity and the sure way of obtaining the blessing of God. Okay, so he is bringing into it, guys, this idea of religion and how this moral thinking plays into your daily life. Industry is essentially, guys, work ethic, you could say, etc. Okay, I'm going to pop down the last one here because this deals a little bit more with government and virtue within it, something we left last time. Look at what it says. Our civil rulers will remember that as piety and virtue, again, that strong word, guys, you almost always hear in founding documents. The honor, now keep in mind, that's the British spelling. So this is before the English Dictionary of American English, the American English Dictionary by Webster, excuse me, had to think there for a second, okay? But happiness of every community, they're particularly requisite of free government. Again, government that's of the people, by the people, for the people. Virtue is the spirit of a republic, for where all power is derived from the people, all depends on their good disposition. But I like what it says here. Neither piety, virtue, or liberty can long flourish in a community where the education of youth is neglected. Okay, that's a strong statement. Had not they laid such foundations for training up their children in knowledge and religion and science and arts, should we have been so respectable a community as we this day appear? Okay, so there's a school of thought out there, guys, that if you want to have an educated society, it starts from the ground up, okay? Which therefore leads us to education, all right? So we'll come back to that in a moment, okay? So again, guys, what you're probably seeing by now is the importance of things like leadership, goals, strategies. We'll get to here in a moment with a few examples. Guys, strategies could be anything from, you're making public speeches to, publishing things in newspapers, things along those lines. And then the outcomes are going to be, okay, how can we see that we're seeing change? Okay, so Dorothea Dix is going to be we'll go through these kind of quick, is going to be the reformer that we usually most associate with the idea of prison reform and mental health facility reform. Okay, and so her argument is that we need to have separate facilities for people that are in prison and people that are also suffering from mental illness. Now, I live in a community that's in Raleigh, and up until a few years ago, guys, we actually had a hospital that was named after Dorothea Dix. Some of you might hear that every so often in your own communities, because she's a really important figure. Because she was in Massachusetts. Now imagine, she's a female, as you can see, okay? So she goes throughout Massachusetts. She's visiting the prisons and the mental health facilities that are pretty much connected. And so she puts together all these different findings, and she wants to go in front of the Massachusetts legislature. From what I understand, they made it clear to her that they would hear her ideas. They would just not hear them directly from her. Okay, so therefore, imagine, guys, you put your life work into wanting to prove that this should happen. You're going to separate facilities. We'll get to the rehabilitation in a moment. And here it is, mostly because of her gender, there was rejection there. Okay, but yet it's a lot like the 19th Amendment with women's suffrage with Susan B. Anthony. You cannot talk about the eventual progress, guys, without the influence of Dorothea Dix. Okay, now there is a religious side to this, and that kind of goes back to the issue of rehabilitation to an extent. Dix ultimately believed that everyone could be rehabilitated. What does that mean? That they could go through a process of things. It could be education, it could be spiritual influence. Those two things could go hand in hand as well. And guys, at the end of the day, is that criminals can be rehabilitated. They can be made a better finished product than they are when they've committed certain crimes, right? Whether it's arson or murder or whatever it might be. Now, as you can imagine, again, you're going to have people that agree with her, and then you're going to have some of those that are on the opposite side of the fence. Okay, but I can tell you, having taught this for a while, that there is a lot of emphasis, guys, in prisons today on rehabilitation. And for those of you that are familiar, not that this is real pleasant to think about, but juvenile justice, a juvenile commits a crime, they're under 18, there are certain states that have laws that if you commit like a murder at age 17, that you could in fact be tried as an adult. But in many states, you are not always tried as an adult. And guys, the juvenile justice system is very much centered around the idea of rehabilitation of minors. All right. So they commit a crime, therefore, because of their age or whatever, they can be rehabilitated. Now, let's take a look at education. I'm going to encourage you all, guys, for a moment, just to pause your screen and get those details down. And ask yourself why you're doing that. As a student, or even myself as a teacher, how in the modern day am I specifically impacted by all of those goals? And strategies are going to be things like going in front of the state board of education, etc. All right, by the way, this is Horace Mann right there. Did y'all have a chance to do that? I hope so. People to support tax-supported schools. That is basically what we associate, guys, with public education. Our tax dollars, probably mostly state, local, to an extent federal. Federal government, guys, has become more involved in education about the last 70 years or so, going back to the launching of Sputnik and before too, but that's the one thing that people tend to leave out sometimes. Okay, but anyway, more qualified teachers. You want to make sure that your teachers are licensed, that they have the knowledge and expertise to be able to give you a quality education in the subject. Okay, so therefore, you have a teacher that has a teaching license or maybe a master's degree in some states that require it. Better content standards for curriculum. What does that mean? Yeah, basically that you have a state curriculum. Guys, all of your teachers, whether you're taking an AP class, an honors class, a standard class, doesn't matter. They can go to your state curriculum or whatever curriculum that defines your school, and they can show you, your families, your parents, their administrators when they're observed. This is the content. These are the skills that these kids are learning, students, pardon me. And you know what? This is exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. All right. You have the right to ask about that. All right. But that's big. The idea of we're going to define curriculum in the way that makes it clear what we want students to gain as far as knowledge and skills throughout the year. Okay. Compulsory, AKA mandatory attendance laws. In other words, students have to attend school up until a certain age. Okay. Again, making sure that we have educated people. And then this is the big one, guys. I put a big star beside. The big picture is education to better one as a citizen. Okay. So therefore, guys, every student, I tell this the first day of my class, you walk through that door. Yes, I want you to learn history. But guys, 20 or 30 years down the line or whatever it is, I want you to look back at your experience in this class and say to myself or yourself, I learned something about history. I also learned something about the citizenship of being a contributor to our society, which if you think about it, that's what all these reformers are doing to a much higher level. All right. So last but not least on the slide, the idea of utopian communities. What is a utopian community? Can we ever have a perfect society? Okay. Well, a lot of these utopian communities, guys, Brook Farm, Oneida, New Harmony, those are three that usually get the most attention. That's a picture of one of them. Okay. They're going to be communities that, are popping up. Why? Because their argument is that there's something about society. It could be like industrialization that's impacting like the nature of people, etc. Okay. And they want to create a society that is based off of true, you know, perfect conditions as best they can define them. Okay. As you can imagine, not all of these work out. In fact, many of them die out over time, but that's the big picture goal. Okay. Now, we talked last time about Republican motherhood. Just to give you a definition again, women, guys, if you go all the way back to even Abigail Adams, she is advocating for education for women. She is advocating for certain things. What a lot of historians tend to think about Abigail Adams, from what I've read, is that she is not advocating for like modern feminism, but she is advocating for the idea of respecting the roles of women and also giving them opportunities to learn and be contributors to at least a family structure, etc. Now, is she saying that women should not work? I don't know if I would go that far, but definitely she's making a strong case that if you want women to really take upon this role of Republican motherhood, you have to equip us with the education to be able to carry it out. Okay. A good definition, if you want to pause your screen, of Republican motherhood: attitude toward a women's roles that emphasize teaching virtue, necessary to become good citizens. Okay. Now, some places in the United States were a lot more proactive with public education. For example, back in the 1640s, the Puritans in Massachusetts created a law called the Old Deluder Satan Act of 1649, basically saying with I think it was a community of 50 families, that you would then be required to have a public school. That would usually be in the church. Okay, so you see that early on in some communities. However, in a lot of places like southern states, in colonies, pardon me, before then, you don't really see that as much. So therefore, you could argue this is going to be very essential in family structure, regardless of whether you have kids going to public school or not. Okay. Why is that a big deal? Because women do feel that their rights are certainly worth building upon, redefining, and extending. Okay. So they have limits to their freedoms. Okay. Staying home was seen as more of an expectation rather than an exception. Okay. Over time, that changes, as we know. Prevented from speaking publicly. Guys, again, that Dorothea Dix story. I mean, imagine your life work has been collecting data from about every prison and mental health facility that you can find to state your case. Separate facilities do these things to make it to where these people have support with developing. And here it is, because partly due to your gender, you're told, no, you can't present. Okay. That's the kind of situation that we're talking about. Okay. And then, not a big surprise, limited voting, property ownership, making wills, and then, guys, even keeping your wages. Okay. So what are they going to be really doing? This is more of the strategies, guys. Revival leadership, reform movements. Women are going to be very active, as we just saw, with a lot of different things. Also, abolition. We'll look at that on the next few slides. But they do organize. Probably, I would say, the most important meeting of any of these movements, you could argue, and that is the Seneca Falls Convention that happens in 1848. This is in Seneca Falls, New York. I've not been to the museum there, but I've heard it's very fascinating to go there. It's a women's rights remembrance. But guys, if you think about it, you've got men and women, mostly women, but some men did attend. And they basically have a big goal. You're going to be reading this as part of your assignment. Okay. And so what did a lot of these women do? They advocated for voting. That's probably the number one thing. Susan B. Anthony was not actually, I don't think, in attendance, but she does become a member moving forward. Right. So you're going to have Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And then, of course, later on, we know that Susan B. Anthony will become a fixture of that movement. Okay. And then we notice that you are going to see some progress toward things like women's colleges, okay? You know, some women moving into other professions, but the biggest jump is going to be between the 1900s and I would say the 2000s and beyond, okay? So Sojourner Truth is going to be an African-American woman. Failed to mention that. That's going to be heavily involved in this movement, but also the abolitionist movement, okay? Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott. You'll notice, guys, again, this is actually a little plaque, if you will, that's actually right outside. It's not a picture that I took. It's one I got online, like I said, but very, very important. These people really push for a lot of these reforms. And then last but not least, for sure, as far as the importance, is going to be the abolitionist movement. Now, something for us to keep in mind with this movement is the big picture is the movement to end slavery. Okay. And just like any other movement, as you can see, you've got David Walker, you've got the Grimke sisters that were right here, William Lloyd Garrison, who's going to publish a newspaper. Guys, get this. William Lloyd Garrison got so angry because he really believed that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. He burned a copy of it. All right. And his reasoning was simple. This document is basically bad. A lot of it went back to slavery. And then probably your most well-known abolitionist, okay, is going to be Frederick Douglass. All right, and you're going to be reading a short excerpt by Douglass later on. But guys, I mean, not all of these people thought the same way about abolition. So you're going to have radical abolitionists, people like John Brown, that took it upon himself to try to arm slaves, basically, you know, got executed because of his involvement at Harper's Ferry. You've got those that are kind of seen kind of in the middle. A lot of people I've read would put Douglass in that position. And then even Garrison would be considered radical. Now, it's kind of an interesting story, guys. During the Civil War, we'll get to that in a few weeks, Lincoln is really in a tough situation, trying to manage the war, manage the country, etc. The story is that there's a few occasions where Frederick Douglass goes into Lincoln's office, a lot like Martin Luther King Jr. did with people like John F. Kennedy and eventually LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson. And he's pleading, talking about Douglass, for Lincoln to, you know, do the Emancipation Proclamation, you know, allow the African Americans to serve in the war. And I think it was Johnson later on that told King, he's like, well, yeah, I know that you want voting, but there's a lot of different issues. Being a political reformer, in the view of some politicians, Lincoln, I think, would agree with this too, guys, is much different than, let's say, being a social reformer. I want you all to maybe think about that. What does that mean, first of all? And second of all, is that correct? Okay. So anyway, so what happens? Well, they've got to be able to overcome one of the most impactful sayings about slavery, which is slavery as a necessary evil. Okay. Now, this is not John C. Calhoun saying it's a positive good or whatever. That's a different quote from the 1830s. But guys, there were people, even they acknowledged, okay, this is immoral, but why is it a necessary evil according to some people's thinking? Guys, take a look. What are we seeing here? Cotton gin, cotton. In other words, there was a lot of wealth for some, not all, but some in the South that was heavily dependent on cotton and also the backs of slave labor. Okay, so therefore, you're going to have a lot of different sets of interests that you got to convince. Okay, we're going to be looking at that a little bit more as we approach the 1850s. Okay, so tactics for abolition, you don't have to write all this down, but maybe at least take a mental note. You've got, in some cases, writings, pamphlets, newspapers, rallies, people meeting, speeches, petitions. Liberia was actually a colony, if you didn't know this, it was created that was actually in, pardon me, what not was, but is in Western Africa. It's actually, its capital is Monrovia, which was named after President James Monroe. And then, of course, the famous Underground Railroad that most of us are familiar with Harriet Tubman. Okay, now this is interesting. Division. The division is not just going to be over how. Radical methods like, John Brown or publishing or whatever. It's going to be, guys, the idea of who can participate. Okay. And this becomes big. I mean, you're looking at even up until the 1850s, you notice that you've got disagreement. All right, I'm not going to go over all these, but the idea, guys, of this, Southerners in Congress passed the gag rule. Okay. Basically making it to where we're not going to even talk about this issue because they saw the handwriting on the wall. Okay. What do I want you all to do with the documents, especially if you haven't done it already? Hang on, and we'll look at that here in a second. All right. Have you had the opportunity, guys, to look over what you see in front of us? I hope that you have. Okay. So basically what this is that this is going to be the activity that you're doing that gives you a little bit more of a closer look at some of these movements. So you've got a couple of things that relate to, the Transcendentalists that we talked briefly about. You've got a short excerpt here from Horace Mann presenting to the Massachusetts State Board of Education about the importance of public education. You've got a very short excerpt from the Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls. And then last but not least, for sure, on page 2, you have a short excerpt from one of the most famous speeches of Frederick Douglass, which is "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" from 1852. Okay, so what you're going to do, guys, is that you're going to actually use the template, okay, that actually you'll see here in just a moment, okay, and I'll show you what that looks like to actually break down your understanding of reform. Okay, guys, so you're going to use the previous document to break down. This is a seminar prep. It kind of gives you a little bit of an idea about how to think about these ideas and break them down. Remember, you want to be using things along the lines of what's in the documents, but also your own thoughts about them. That's where you have connections between not just what's in the document, but your own interpretation of it. And then you'll notice, guys, again, if we were to have time, we would talk a little bit more about people and their reform-mindedness then and now. And then I do want you to basically generate your own question and your own thought. If you're in class, we'll talk about this a little bit more. As always, feel free to email me at franklinacademy.org, okay? And let me really, really quick give you the reminders. Okay, so this assignment you're going to want to have done by the end of the period. Or by the end of the next few days. The quiz for this week will be covering, remember, 10 questions that cover the nationalism things that we covered in our first session, the reform movements, okay? So you want to make sure that you've read, you want to make sure that you've really engaged in these lessons, you understand the contributions of some key people, okay? And the most important thing, guys, beyond that is the outcomes. What kinds of things did they kind of move us in the direction of thinking about reform? Okay, next week we will be transitioning to the age of Andrew Jackson's presidency and also the concept of manifest destiny, which is kind of neat to consider. We are almost at that point of the 1850s Civil War. Okay, so 1830s are on the horizon coming up here. Okay, and then again, make sure that you've checked everything that you need to submit through Canvas. Okay, the activities, the quiz will be the last thing for the week. And as always, contact me if you need anything. Okay, and for those of you that are doing this remotely or virtual still, remember joining class to begin, and also the last few minutes to verify that you watched the video that you need to if you do not attend the one in class. Okay, hope you're doing well. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.